right, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you this morning, and I'm grateful that you're here and that we can jump into a conversation about virtual progress monitoring and how that works in our current state and situation. So thanks for being here this morning. For those of you who don't know, we're the Diverse Learners Cooperative. We're a nonprofit organization based in Tennessee, and we connect teachers and leaders with learning resources and networks they need to improve outcomes for diverse learners. This morning, we are going to jump in to learn more about progress monitoring and best practices for the virtual setting. We'll start with setting the stage. What do we need to know about progress monitoring in order to do this well? Think about the what, when, and how to stay organized with it, and then evaluate and respond. All right, so what is progress monitoring? I moved my computer this way. What is progress monitoring? So progress monitoring is an assessment practice that's administered on a regular basis, but its true purpose is to identify the most meaningful goals for our students and plan the right instruction and intervention and provide meaningful student feedback, and then communicate that with team members and families so that we can do better for our students. The state defines progress monitoring in a fairly narrow way, but these are the purposes for that work. Progress monitoring should assess specific skills at the student's instructional level, be sensitive to small increments of growth over time, be administered efficiently within a short amount of time, which we have short amounts of time definitely right now, be administered repeatedly, at least every other week, and then result in data that is applicable to the progress, to measuring progress, and then relevant to planning. In the state's definition, we also know that we need to report results so that the rate of improvement can be calculated based on national percentiles and then transferred to a graph form of some sort. But in a virtual setting, we know that there are limitations to how we fulfill the true definitions of progress monitoring. One is that we don't have FaceTime with the student in a typical way, in physical FaceTime. And so rapport building can really influence the results of our progress monitoring measures. We also have difficulties with students getting access to technology, the actual device, and then to internet, which can limit the amounts and types of progress monitoring that we can collect. Students may have access to a caregiver who might support them during an assessment, or a lack of access to a caregiver that might help them get set up with an assessment, and that can be a limitation in the virtual environment. And finally, and most importantly, the reliability and usability of this virtually collected data can be limited, especially because we haven't normed these tools on virtual administrations of them. But knowing these limitations, we might ask ourselves, can I use what we already have, but just do it virtually? For example, if I have AimsWeb or FastBridge or EasyCBM, can I use those virtually? And what, of course, our vendors are saying is, yes, you can. And they're rapidly putting together tools that help folks do that and do that well. But at the same time, we also know that those results that we get from these tools are not normed across students. And we need to use caution about making judgments based on those assessment results. So best practice would say that we use, small one, nope. The best practice would say that we use multiple forms of data to collect this information. We would use a small group instruction. Betty. We would use small group instruction. We might make observations virtually. We could use one-on-one check-ins. We might have tech platforms that have progress monitoring implemented already in them. We could use our parents or even our students to, I'm sorry, y'all. Josh, can you? I have a 4-year-old here who would love to be in this video. So we can use all sorts of data to really put together a much broader, but also specific picture of what our students can and can't do. So we're going to go through some examples of what that looks like. John.
Okay. All right. You click that to the next one there, Brooke. So we're going to start off, thinking of the examples, easy CBMs, AIMSweb, FastBridge, those types of ones, sort of the more narrow definition the state has given us around progress monitoring tools. And so we'll start with reading, specifically reading fluency, and in a synchronous environment. So when, with this reading fluency, when might you do it? Certainly at least every other week. The state says you can do more than that. Just we had a quick research. There's not been a big difference in outcomes of people progress monitoring every week versus like every other or even every third week, just at least every other week. So it'd be important to send a reoccurring calendar link to the student, certainly the parent if that they're going to be heavily involved if it's younger students. This will need to be done clearly in a one-on-one situation, so maybe in a breakout room before or after class, or maybe just during a weekly check-in, one-on-one check-in time that's already established. And certainly obviously important to coordinate that with the family. So this is kind of the big question of how do you do that? So imagine we've got this reading passage fluency probe. It's 1 minute. You've got, it's just you, the teacher, and the student. You're on a Zoom call. So that's kind of the scenario. So you'd want to, before you share anything, certainly just read through the directions, because a lot of them do have some standardized directions that they want you to read. And then you'd actually put here on the left, if you can see, that's the passage, and that's a student view. So you'd actually put that in a separate window and then share that screen. So that's the only thing the student's going to see. And then on the right of the teacher's screen, the right side would actually be the teacher view, where you're actually going to be recording, their accuracy. So essentially, student has their view of their passage, and you've got yours as a teacher marking, essentially figuring out how many correct words per minute they've gotten. And if you want to see an action, we've linked in a tutorial from FastBridge, and I know that a lot of you may not be using FastBridge, but it's still a good way just to think through how to do that, and that's the instructors sort of showing what it would look like. So it starts at minute 28. It's nearly an hour-long video. If you want to skip ahead, go to minute 28 on that. All right, next one. So the next one here is math, and this will be in an asynchronous. So math can be given oftentimes in a group. It doesn't have to be one-on-one. So certainly want to, again, have standard time, scheduled every other week. In some cases, you need to set up that time window within the platform, so it's scheduled. Send a recurring invite, certainly, and then logins, tech logins, do so many logins to help folks remember, sort of embed the login information in the calendar invitation to the student or their parent if they're going to be assisting. And certainly coordinate those expectations with the student and family. So how might you do this? Again, imagine there's a teacher and there's 4 students in the group. You're on the Zoom call, and the students will be taking assessments on their own laptops, right, or their own device. So for the first time, even though we're saying you can do this asynchronously, the first time I would do it in a synchronous way to practice. So imagine the teacher, in an ideal world, if you can do this, actually has gotten a student login, so they can just share, the teacher can share a screen from the point of view of a student login, and actually just walks through each of the students, like this is what it looks like. And then actually at that point have the students log in themselves and try to take the assessment while the teacher's on, to kind of troubleshoot any issues that come up. And have that really, that first one, almost that data points, I wouldn't include it if you could, because this is just practice. You want to make sure there's validity to the results. And the first go around, given this is such a new environment to do it in, I would definitely make it just a practice. But after the practice, you'd have a scheduled time to do it in the calendar, and the students would then log on, and you could just be text them, hey, don't forget to do, take the math pro, but they would be doing it on their own. All right, Brooke, next up. This next example is important for lots of reasons, but engagement virtually has obviously been a challenge at times. And so as an organization, as a teacher, thinking like, how are we going to monitor student engagement? Sort of when are you going to do it? How often? All those type of things, but certainly taking data as often as possible, and so you can adjust to it at least weekly. So the how might you monitor engagement? There's lots of different ways. It certainly means redefining what attendance means. So coming up, like, how do I measure success on student engagement? And then how am I going to monitor that? So you could track logins, participation in live classes, completion of asynchronous work. And I know there are probably lots of other ways you can monitor engagement. A qualitative way to measure it would be to actually just talk to the students, like maybe do like an interview, have a standard interview, and do it twice a quarter, and just ask them various questions around how they're feeling about the work. Does it feel purposeful? Do they need any additional support? And that'll get you great data you can use to adjust, but also it's just a great way to build relationship, stay connected to the student. So Brooke, let's go to the next one there. So here's some just general tips. Of course, do an equipment check. Tech is not always easy. Preparing your materials and student materials ahead of time. We talked about practicing. I know some folks are going to actually practice with a teacher first, another adult, before they even try it with the students. There will be connectivity issues. So plan in advance, like if X happens, what am I going to do about it? So certainly have thought through that. And then just, of course, coordinating with the student and family and teacher schedules, so it's not overlapping and conflicting with anything. So this is super important, especially for the asynchronous or for younger students. But explain the purpose behind these assessments. They might walk in when a student's taking a math monitoring probe, see the student struggling, and be like, oh, they're having trouble with the math. I'm going to help them with their math, not realizing what's the purpose of the assessment. So just encourage folks to really communicate with each caregiver, like, this is the purpose, and this is when would be a good time to help, and this is when we don't want you to help. So just making sure that's really clear for them, sort of the do's and don'ts around virtual progress monitoring. Maybe even make a one-pager for families. I don't know. So we've got all this data. I've talked about reading and math and monitoring engagement. So you've got all this data, and now let's try to make sense of it. So we've linked in 2 different trackers that folks could use, and there's also the first one here. The goal tracker is for IEP goals. So if you just want to have students, as simple as they're writing down the annual goals, and then you're just adding in every week or however often, like, quantitative and qualitative data to that. And then on the right, there's the graph one. Certainly that I know some programs automatically graph every time you add, progress monitoring probe, but you could also do that in Excel, for example, where it graphs the data for you too. And that's what this is an example of there on the far right. And then the comprehensive data tracker, if you wanted to have all your data in one spot for all your students, we've linked into some example. And specifically, when you get to it, there's different tabs. There's like a formative assessment tab and a summative data tab and engagement and different examples. But what you can just want to push folks to really emphasize, not as much as summative data, so not as much end of quarter data, but more data from this week or this day. Because you only have so much time to do an assessment. I mean, we have less time with students, and so we really need to think through which data are we prioritizing. All right, Brooke, we go to the next one there. Here's another example of just staying organized. Another way to collect that data is this every week. If you're You could have this create a Google form, has the same questions, and the data, you answer the questions, it's automatically placed into a Google Sheet. And then later on, you can just sort it by student. So whatever questions you need to answer to monitor their progress, you can actually just pull that up for each student every week and answer those questions. So now you've got all the data. Now you got to do something with it. So evaluate it and respond. And sort of down there at the bottom there where it says the data is only as good as your ability to take it and do something with it. So if you're not going to use the data on a regular basis, you might reconsider actually gathering that data, unless of course it's required. So in the shorter the cycle, the better. So I kind of alluded to this earlier. If you can emphasize data that helps inform instruction for tomorrow's class or next week's class, like making that a priority over like looking at a unit assessment at the end of the quarter, and when the student misconceptions could have taken, they like missed that or messed that up a month ago. So it's a little late at that point to respond. So just emphasizing, shorten the cycle. So the next steps, what do you need to do? You need to just sort of identify again what you're going to monitor, figure out which tools you're going to use for each of those, whether it be math or reading or engagement. Schedule times to progress monitor, and then collect that data and adjust based on what you got.
Thanks, Josh. So we are here for questions and can open it up. But I wanted to also let you know that we're trying to do these coffee chats every Friday morning and pick topics that are really timely for you all. And they are also, we're recording them, and it's my child making his debut in the recording. We will post the material, we'll get you the materials and the recording afterwards too, so that you can use it as a reference. All of the materials that we referenced here are linked, and so you'll be able to click on those and access them yourselves. Next week, Mary Matthews is kicking us off with virtual behavior supports and what we need to be thinking about for making sure that our students feel successful and able to engage in appropriate ways. But we would love to open it up for questions. So if you are headed off, have a wonderful day, but we're here for questions as well.